So I want you to imagine an ATM sitting right there in your front yard.
Okay, a very weird APM, but I'm with you.
Right. But instead of dispensing $20 bills, this machine just constantly spits out, you know, raw lumber, heavy crude oil, critical minerals.
Basically, the entire Canadian resource sector.
Exactly. Now, imagine your neighbor comes over every single day, empties the machine, takes all those materials back to their house, processes them into these like super high-tech goods, and then turns around and sells them back to you at an enormous premium.
That's quite the business model for the neighbor.
Yeah, but wait, it gets worse. To top it all off, they've just installed this massive toll booth right on your own driveway, and they're literally charging you for the privilege of handing them your raw materials in the first place. That asymmetrical relationship, that's the exact paradox we are unpacking in today's deep dive. We have this massive stack of 2026 economic data in front of us.
And it is a dense stack. I mean, we're talking major reports.
All right, we've got the latest from Statistics Canada, the Bank of Canada, the OECD, and the IMF. And our mission today is to answer one really defining question for you. Can Canada actually pivot from being this, struggling exporter of raw materials into North America's high-tech green energy manufacturing powerhouse?
It's the multi-trillion-dollar question, really, because when you look at the baseline data for 2025 and 2026, the numbers are just flashing this stark warning.
Yeah, they're pretty grim.
I mean, this is a country incredibly rich in natural resources, right?
Hmm.
And boasting one of the most highly educated workforces on the planet, yet labor productivity has just slid down to about 78% of the United States level.
That's a huge gap.
It is. And per capita GDP, which is, the actual tangible wealth per person, that's dropped to somewhere between 70 to 78% of America's. So Canada is truly standing at this urgent crossroads right now.
So it's basically the choice between remaining that raw materials ATM we talked about or, leveraging nuclear tech and critical minerals to become the physical foundation of the whole global AI revolution.
Right, exactly.
But before we get to the pivot, we really have to look at the structural trap Canada is currently caught in. And from the data, it's totally defined by this extreme historical dependency. I mean, even now in 2026, something like 72 to 76% of all Canadian exports go directly to the U.S.
Yeah, and the nature of what is being exported has really degraded over time.
How so?
Well, Canada's manufacturing sector has essentially hollowed out over the last 2 decades. If you look back at the early 2000s, manufacturing drove about 15 to 20% of the national GDP.
Okay.
Today, it sits at roughly 9%.
Wow, so it got cut in half.
Basically, yeah. The economy is now propped up by this massive reliance on raw exports. We're talking heavy oil pumped almost exclusively to U.S. refineries and, raw timber that's constantly caught in these perpetual trade disputes.
Which brings us to the external pressure that's actively crushing what's left of that 9% manufacturing base. Yeah. Let's talk about the toll booth on the driveway.
Ah, yes. The tariffs.
Right, because between 2025 and 2026, we saw this devastating wave of U.S. tariff policies. And, I mean, the baseline 25 to 35% general tariffs are punishing enough on their own.
Oh, absolutely.
But the real structural weapon in these reports is the modification to the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Yeah, and economists are actually calling this the nuclear option for a very specific reason.
Break that down for us because it sounds intense.
Okay, so historically, a tariff on steel was just a tax on the raw metal itself. If you bought a ton of steel from across the border, you paid a penalty on the value of that raw commodity.
Right, basic trade protectionism.
Exactly. But under the new 2026 rules, the 50% tariff is applied to the entire manufacturing value add of the derivative product.
Okay, so think about what that actually means on the factory floor for a second. Let's say a manufacturer in Ontario imports some raw steel. Their workers spend hundreds of hours, cutting, machining, welding, and assembling that steel. They incorporate advanced hydraulics and proprietary software to build this amazing million-dollar piece of agricultural machinery, like a high-tech tractor.
Right. And under this modified Section 232, the U.S. Customs Office doesn't just tax the raw steel hiding inside the tractor.
No?
No, they tax the final total price of the completed machine at 50%.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They are literally taxing the Canadian labor, the engineering ingenuity, and the company's profit margin.
But that completely bypasses the entire point of the USMCA. I mean, it obliterates any free trade protections those agreements were supposed to have.
It renders the agreement completely moot for deep processing manufacturers. I
Mm.
mean, this is no longer a protective tariff. It is a targeted mechanism for forced industrial transfer.
Forced industrial transfer, that's a heavy phrase.
It is, but the math forces your hand. If you run that tractor company and you're facing a 50% penalty on the value your engineers add to a product, you have basically two options.
Go bankrupt.
Exactly. You declare bankruptcy, or you physically pack up your deep processing and assembly lines and move them directly onto U.S. soil. It systematically strips Canada of its high-value manufacturing potential.
So the external tariffs act as a hammer. But looking through this internal fiscal data, it seems like Canada's own domestic policies are acting as the anvil here.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Right, because you have to wonder, why hasn't Canada been able to innovate its way around this? We have to look objectively at how capital is flowing internally.
And that's where the IMF and Bank of Canada reports get really illuminating.
Exactly, because when a government massively expands complex social spending, we have to ask, does that actively crowd out the capital required for private sector innovation?
Well, according to the macroeconomic data here, it shows a very clear mechanism of capital starvation.
Capital starvation.
Yeah, because since 2015, Canadian government spending surged by 58.3%.
Which is massive.
It's massive. But the critical variable isn't just the amount, it's how that capital was deployed. It wasn't channeled into building new high-tech ports or expanding rail networks or funding massive research and development incubators.
Right.
The vast majority of that national wealth was routed into complex day-to-day social transfers. We're talking programs like national pharmacare, expanded dental plans, and, increased pension obligations.
And when a state directs that proportion of its wealth into immediate consumption rather than capital investments, it essentially just drains the pool of resources.
Exactly.
So like a bank or a private investor has less capital available to lend to a tech startup that's trying to buy advanced robotics or scale a new AI software platform.
And that lack of physical and intellectual capital investment, it translates directly into productivity stagnation.
Because they're stuck with old tools.
Exactly. A worker using 10-year-old machinery simply cannot produce as much value per hour as a worker using state-of-the-art automation.
So you have this capital starvation, right? And then you add the demographic strain into the mix, because the immigration data from the last few years shows a system that, quite literally, simply broke the math of the physical infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely. We saw the immigration backlog peak at over 1 million files at the IRCC.
Over 1 million files.
Yeah. But we have to be careful here and draw a sharp distinction found in the data, because the economic impact of immigration is not uniform at all.
Right, we have to look at the different categories.
Right. Highly skilled economic immigrants. So tech workers from India, for instance, they are a massive net positive fiscal driver.
Oh, for sure.
They integrate into high-paying sectors, they earn above the local average, and they contribute really heavily to the tax base.
Right, so the crisis wasn't the skilled workers. The crisis was the aggregate volume.
Exactly.
Because when you surge the population with massive numbers of temporary residents, refugees, and family-class immigrants all simultaneously, well, they all immediately require housing, transit, and healthcare.
You cannot expand a population at that unprecedented velocity without a corresponding massive expansion in physical infrastructure.
And as we just established, that infrastructure investment wasn't happening because the government capital was tied up in those social welfare transfers.
Right. It's a collision of two major policy trajectories.
And the real-world friction of that mismatch is captured perfectly well, tragically, by this metric from the Fraser Institute.
Oh, the wait times data.
Yes. In 2025, the national median wait time for specialist medical treatment in Canada hit 28.6 weeks.
Over half a year.
Over half a year. And that isn't just a healthcare failure, it is an economic drag. When people are sitting at home sick or injured for 7 months instead of working, that system overload costs the economy $4.2 billion in lost wages and productivity.
And it creates this deeply destructive feedback loop.
How so?
Well, diminished productivity generates less tax revenue, right? But meanwhile, the overloaded healthcare system demands ever more emergency funding just to stay afloat. And this structural reality is exactly what forced the massive U-turn in policy across 2025 and 2026.
Yeah, which led to Canada experiencing its first actual population shrinkage since the 1940s.
It's historic.
It really is. And I mean, think of global talent like fluid dynamics.
Okay, fluid dynamics.
Yeah, human capital will naturally flow away from high-pressure, high-friction environments like,
Yeah.
heavy taxation paired with overloaded infrastructure, and it will pool into low-resistance areas.
That's a great analogy.
Right, because when a highly skilled engineer realizes they're paying a huge premium in taxes for a system where they have to wait 28 weeks to see a specialist, the social contract essentially breaks. That is the exact moment they start returning calls from recruiters down in Texas or Silicon Valley.
And the out-migration numbers demonstrate that fluid dynamic perfectly.
Give us stats on that.
So in the 2024 to 2025 period, net out-migration hit a half-century high of over 65,000 people.
Wow.
And the most concerning part, nearly 70% of those individuals held university degrees.
So we're talking top-tier graduates in medicine, engineering, computer science.
Exactly. They are making a completely rational economic calculation. They're fleeing to the U.S. for massive salaries at FAANG tech companies, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and significantly lower tax burdens.
And this phenomenon is known as capital shallowing, right?
Yes, capital shallowing. Because when you lose your most highly educated young professionals, you lose the foundational capacity to innovate.
Which leads to what might honestly be the darkest warning in this entire stack of reports, the OECD projections for the coming decades.
Yeah, this part is sobering. Based on this severe capital shallowing and the compounding regulatory burden we just talked about, the OECD forecasts Canada to have the absolute worst economic performance among all developed nations between 2030 and 2060.
The worst out of all developed nations.
The worst. They project a meager 0.8% annual per capita GDP growth over those 3 decades. Yeah. Without a massive structural shift, Canada is basically on a trajectory to become a low-wage, labor-intensive economy, relegated to supplying unrefined dirt and free, university-trained talent to the United States.
So, okay, the pressure system is broken. The manufacturing base is fleeing the tariffs. The domestic capital is tied up in welfare. And the talent is flowing south.
It sounds bleak when you list it all out like that.
It does, but hey, the entire purpose of this deep dive is to evaluate the pivot. We aren't just here to admire the problem.
Right, absolutely.
Because the blueprint for a turnaround totally exists in these documents. But it requires a total reimagining of Canada's economic identity. I mean, Canada cannot outcompete the U.S. in building AI software brains, so to speak. It simply doesn't have the venture capital concentration of a Silicon Valley.
No, it doesn't.
But it can become the physical body that powers those brains.
Yes. And to understand the viability of this pivot, you really have to look at the sheer physics of artificial intelligence.
Okay, the physics of AI.
Right, because training and running these massive large language models, it requires an unfathomable amount of continuous electricity. The International Energy Agency predicts that global data centers will demand 900 terawatt hours of new electricity by 2035.
900 terawatt hours. I mean, you can't just plug a demand like that into the existing grid.
You really can't. And that is the huge vulnerability of the United States right now. The U.S. power grid is aging, it's highly fragmented, and it's still heavily reliant on carbon-intensive fossil fuels.
And the big tech companies don't want that.
Exactly. Tech giants are desperate for massive, reliable, 24/7 baseline power that doesn't violate their corporate climate pledges.
And this is where Canada's natural geography and its legacy infrastructure suddenly become its greatest weapon.
Yep.
Because Canada already operates one of the cleanest, most reliable electrical grids in the entire world, largely driven by hydro and nuclear power.
Yep.
But the real structural advantage, the ace up the sleeve here, is its global lead in small modular reactors, or SMRs.
Yeah, SMRs are a game changer. We need to explain the mechanics of SMRs to really understand why they are so revolutionary.
Go for it.
So, traditional nuclear power relies on these bespoke, multi-billion-dollar concrete megaprojects. Every component is custom-built on-site, which inevitably leads to decades of regulatory delays and just massive cost overruns.
Right, you hear about a plant being built and it takes 30 years.
Exactly. But SMRs fundamentally change that geometry. They operate on economies of volume.
Okay.
They are smaller, inherently safer reactors designed to be manufactured on an assembly line in a factory. Then they're shipped on a flatbed truck and assembled on site.
It's like building commercial airplanes instead of custom mansions.
That's a perfect way to visualize it, yes. And Canada, specifically the province of Ontario, has already taken a massive lead in the regulatory approval, development, and deployment of these SMR projects.
which totally shifts the economic model for the whole country. Instead of extracting raw, heavy oil from Alberta and pumping it south at a massive discount for American refineries to process, Canada can deploy its SMRs right alongside its clean hydro grid to host massive AI data centers domestically.
Right.
The export is no longer the raw energy, the export is the compute. Canada can sell highly lucrative, zero-carbon green compute to the global market.
And it creates an anchor. Think about it. If the data centers are built in Canada, because that's where the clean power is, the tech ecosystem naturally forms around them.
Okay, wait, hold on. Powering the AI revolution makes total sense, but building the physical hardware for the green transition is the other half of this blueprint, right?
Yes.
But when I read the sections of these reports focusing on mining and timber, I mean, it sounds exactly like the old raw resource Canada we're supposedly trying to escape. How does doubling down on digging dirt and cutting logs make us a high-tech powerhouse?
It's a really vital distinction to make because the pivot isn't about exporting raw dirt or raw logs anymore. It's about processing them domestically.
Yeah.
The green transition requires an astronomical supply of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, and nickel for things like electric vehicle batteries, solar panels, and AI hardware components.
And Canada has a lot of that.
Oh, massive amounts. Canada possesses enough lithium reserves in the ground to meet half of the entire global demand from 2030 all the way to 2050.
Wow. Supplying half the global demand, that is a staggering lever of power.
It is, but the strategy completely relies on establishing what the reports call a democratic supply chain.
What does that mean?
Well, currently, Western nations are terrified of relying on geopolitical rivals to refine these critical minerals. So Canada's strategy must be to refuse the export of raw ore. By utilizing its domestic clean energy, Canada can refine these minerals and manufacture the high-value battery precursors inside its own borders.
I see.
Yeah, supplying Western allies who strictly require high ESG, meaning environmental, social, and governance standards.
So we basically leverage the geopolitical anxiety. If the US and Europe want secure, ethically sourced batteries, they can't just buy the cheap raw materials from anywhere. They have to buy the finished, refined product from Canada.
Exactly. Furthermore, Canada can deploy its remaining high-tech advantages to modernize those traditional extraction sectors in the first place.
Right.
Despite the brain drain we discussed, institutions in places like Toronto and Montreal remain foundational hubs for open-source artificial intelligence research.
So instead of trying to build, a consumer chatbot to compete with the US tech giants, Canada applies.
Yeah, Canada is pioneering low-carbon green aluminum, where the smelting process utilizes clean hydropower. This effectively removes the massive carbon footprint that's usually associated with aluminum production.
And mass timber isn't just cutting 2x4s. This is cross-laminated timber. By stacking and gluing layers of wood grain at right angles, engineers create a highly refined product that actually achieves the structural tensile strength of steel and concrete, but at a fraction of the carbon cost.
It's incredible tech. And when Canada scales these specific industries, it creates a highly refined, low-carbon industrial base. Products like hydro-smelted aluminum and cross-laminated timber are virtually immune to future global carbon tariffs.
It completely flips the leverage. I mean, instead of being penalized by American steel tariffs, Canada is suddenly manufacturing engineered mass timber and green aluminum that the U.S. construction industry desperately needs to import just to meet its own domestic climate targets.
Exactly. The transition from a vulnerable raw materials exporter to an indispensable high-value green manufacturing hub, it suddenly becomes mathematically sound.
So pulling all these threads together for you, the narrative arc of this 2026 data is really undeniable. Canada is at a critical juncture precisely because the historical model is mathematically dead. The reliance on NAFTA, the USMCA, and the strategy of blindly exporting raw goods south has been killed.
Yeah, it's over.
It was dismantled by aggressive U.S. tariffs designed to strip away value-added manufacturing. And it was crippled internally by a productivity stagnation driven by social spending that starved private investment and an overloaded infrastructure that drove away top talent.
But the blueprint for a profound revival is entirely visible in these documents.
It really is.
By capitalizing on its head start in SMR nuclear technology, maximizing its vast, clean electrical grids, and fundamentally insisting on refining its critical minerals domestically, Canada can execute the pivot. It can transition from being the raw materials ATM into the indispensable physical hardware layer for North America's entire tech and green energy future.
Which is an incredible vision.
It is, though implementing that blueprint requires a radical shift in how Canada operates internally. And it actually leaves us with a critical structural question to ponder.
Let's hear it.
If Canada's greatest historical weakness has been its fragmented internal market, the reality that provincial regulations often make it easier to trade south with the United States than east-west across its own borders, what would happen if Canada finally forced a unified, barrier-free national market? What economic velocity could be unlocked if Ottawa started treating its own provinces as its greatest, most vital trading partners?
That is a fascinating thought. What happens when the ATM unplugs from the neighbor's house and plugs into its own grid? We will leave that question hanging for you to think about today. Keep digging, keep questioning, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.